السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Ramadan Kareem. Today, MDCC organized a webinar with title Structuring Corporate Governance in Contemporary Organizations. Our partner, George Kesteven, will present this webinar today. George Kesteven is the founder and CEO of Kesteven and Associates and Phrontex lead consultant. Since 1989, he has been providing management and documentation services to the public and private organizations in Australia and overseas. George's specialty is the design and implementation of integrated management and governance systems, helping organizations and their managers meet their compliance and governance obligations effectively, efficiently, and quickly. Since 2010, George has been the designer and lead consultant for Phrontex, a web-based application for developing and controlling organizational management systems. Phrontex is used by mid-size and large organizations around the world, working with complex governance requirements relating to the financial control, stock exchange requirement, including Sarbanes-Oxley, health, safety, environment, engineering, and industrial process control, and aviation. George's experience covers a very wide range of industries. So, the microphone's now with you, George. You can start your webinars, and I will disappear until the questions and answer sessions. Good luck, George. You can start.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is George Kesteven, as Sadek has just introduced. The purpose of this presentation is to give you the ability to design and lead the corporate governance activities within your organization. If you are responsible for corporate governance, you will learn how to meet those responsibilities effectively and efficiently. You will be able to ensure that your organization is aware of its governance obligations and is in a position to prove that it is doing everything that it should to meet those obligations. I'm going to show you how to design and implement an effective corporate governance structure within your organization. We're going to walk through the elements of an effective corporate governance system. I'll show you how to define those elements, how to set up your corporate framework, and how to implement and monitor your system. By the end of this webinar, you'll be able to approach your organization's corporate governance confident that you know how to define and manage your requirements and to ensure that your organization is doing everything that it should to meet those requirements. The system that I'm presenting here today is the product of many years consulting experience, setting up governance and management systems for major corporations in a wide range of industries. To give you an idea of the effectiveness of this method, a few years ago, my company was asked to assist with a new business. There was a startup company here in Australia that had just bought a set of coal mines, a total of about $5 billion worth of investment. There was a parent company in China that was owned by another company that was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. The corporate governance requirements here were complex, to say the least. The Australian company had to prepare for public listing on the Australian Stock Exchange so it was subject to Australian Stock Exchange requirements. As a subsidiary of a Chinese company, it was subject to Chinese government regulations. And as a major subsidiary of a company listed in the United States, it was subject to US requirements, in particular to Sarbanes-Oxley. The auditors said that it was going to take us 18 months at least to implement a corporate governance system. But using the framework that I'm going to show you today, the company successfully passed its first audit 3 months instead of 18 months. So, let me show you my vision for a simple, effective way to manage corporate governance. What we're going to cover today is how to implement corporate governance in your organization. Excuse me. Ooh. How to define your governance objectives, how to implement your governance activities, and how to monitor and review your governance system. First, let's get some definitions in place. When you read about corporate governance, you'll see that people use the term in two senses. First, they talk about external governance. These are activities outside the corporation that constrain how it works and ensure that the organization is behaving as it should in relation to society as a whole. This covers government oversight, stock exchange rules, industry and professional standards. These are things that are done out in the world that constrain how your organization. Quite often when you read about corporate governance, this is what the media is talking about. For example, after the global financial crisis, when there was a lot of discussion about whether the banks had been adequately controlled, the references to corporate governance were talking about these external factors. The second refers to internal governance. These refer to the controls established by the organization itself to ensure that the organization is functioning as its managers intend that it should, with a reasonable expectation that the organization will achieve its objectives. Internal governance covers board structure and standards, policies, the organization's management system, and the internal audit, monitoring, and reporting systems. Now, for practical purposes, these two are closely related. Internal governance means making sure that the organization is meeting its governance objectives. For a well-behaved organization, these objectives include all the obligations imposed on it from external sources. So from a social point of view, from a corporate citizenship point of view, governance covers both external and internal governance. So, what is corporate governance? First important point is that good governance equals good management. Governance and management are not separate concepts. They're two sides of the same coin. Managing an organization and managing it well mean the same thing. The intention is always to ensure that your organization is functioning in such a way that there is a reasonable expectation that it will achieve its objectives. This is what all managers are trying to do, and this is what your governance framework exists to achieve. Governance means doing three things. It means understanding your operating context. You need to know the external factors that you need to take into account in the course of managing your organization. The external factors that constrain how you operate and that define what it means for your organization to be functioning appropriately and successfully. It's an obvious management requirement anyway, and it's an explicit requirement for most management system standards like ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and so on. To meet those standards, the requirements of those standards, you have to be aware of what's going on in the world in which your organization operates. Second, you have to define what you mean by well managed. What do you want it to mean when people say, my organization is well managed? To say that your organization is well managed means being in a position to make a set of statements about it. Statements like, our activities are legal, our activities are safe, we have a reliable workforce, and so on. You'll see in the course of this presentation, a large part of the work in developing your governance system is precisely this, to define what to do in order to be able to say that, with confidence, it is well managed. Third, you need to be able to prove it. You need to define the detail of what you must do, not only to achieve your governance objectives, but to be confident that you can point to the policies, procedures, position descriptions, and records that substantiate your claims about your organization. Your employees must be confident that if they do their work according to the documentation you give to them, that their activities will be legal, safe, and effective. Your managers must be satisfied that the activities they are responsible for will be legal, safe, and effective, and that their liabilities as managers are being met. And third, your executives and directors must be confident that the organization is functioning as they intend that it should. Ultimately, this means that your governance system exists to give everybody confidence in your organization. Your employees, your managers, your directors and executives, all of them need to be confident that your organization is doing what it should. So, integrated corporate governance. There are three parts to an integrated governance framework. The first we've touched on is the operating context. These are the external factors and commercial imperatives that constrain how your organization operates. We'll go through each of these in detail in a moment. Second are your governance objectives. These are the things you have to achieve for you to be able to say that your organization is well managed. It's usually convenient to divide these into four types. Policies, meaning statements from the board and senior management that set overarching rules for how the organization will operate. Compliance obligations, these are the external constraints that the organization must comply with, like statutes, professional standards, constraints that the organization chooses to comply with, like, for example, ISO 9001, ISO 14001. Legal commitments, these are obligations arising from your contracts, leases, permits, and other formal agreements that the organization has chosen to commit to. And risks, these are objectives arising from assessment of the organization's risks. Organizations vary greatly in the extent to which these types of objective are important to them. Organizations engaged in resource exploration, for example, generally have very large numbers of legal commitments in the forms of the exploration permits, leases, licenses, permits, and so on. And And a large part of the governance system in such organizations is directed to making sure that none of those commitments is ever missed. And third, implementation. These are the things that you actually have to do in the organization to achieve your governance objectives and to be able to prove it. So, taking these elements in turn, understanding the operating context. It means working through the factors that influence or constrain how your organization should operate. Some management system standards, again like ISO 9001 or 14000, include situational awareness as a formal compliance step. Now, if you have a non-integrated management system, you might look at these, assess your operating context individually for each management system standard. But it actually makes more sense to address this as a single task rather than carrying it out separately for quality and for safety and for risk management and so on. The range of factors you have to deal with will vary according to your location, your jurisdiction, your industry, the circumstances, but these are the common ones. Stakeholder requirements. The organization's stakeholders may impose requirements on how the organization operates as a matter of principle. For example, your shareholders may insist that certain rules be followed in how the organization functions. In some industries and jurisdictions, stakeholders include other participants in the supply chain or in the industry, and they may set rules for how the organization functions. This is particularly common in Japan, for example, where major suppliers and major customers have a significant stake in how an organization functions. In Europe, in particular in Germany, unions and banks have a lot of sway over how the organization functions, and they may set constraints that need to become part of your governance system. Laws and regulations. This is normally the largest area of concern. Of course, an organization is subject to all the laws and regulations of the jurisdictions it operates in, but for governance purposes, what we're concerned with are the laws and regulations that require the organization to do something that it otherwise might not do. The laws and regulations that require controls to be in place to prevent something happening or to manage the risk of litigation. Laws and regulations that require a level of training and awareness on the part of your personnel. For example, for some types of industry and activity, it may be that a person holding a particular position in the organization must be familiar with a particular law or a particular set of regulations. Another common source of governance requirements are management system standards. Again, ISO 9000. The standards the organization chooses to comply with. There may be industry and professional codes that the organization needs to comply with. For example, if you are a manufacturing organization, then you may need to comply with product codes. I mean, in the steel industry, for example, if you manufacture steel, you need to meet the industry standards for your products. Contracts and agreements. By definition, a contract creates obligations for its signatories. So within your governance system, if you have signed contracts, then you may need to have a formal system in place to ensure that you meet the terms of those contracts. Or you may need a system in place to make sure that the other signatories to your contracts are meeting their obligations to you. Again, it's part of your governance objectives to make sure that the contract is implemented correctly, both by you and by the other parties. Licenses and permits, quite often, again in the resource sector for example, permits may require regular reporting, they may constrain the activities you can carry out and so on. And risk assessments. Conducting risk assessments will identify things that you need to do to ensure the continued good operation of your business. Now there's an overlap here with other requirements, for example, management system standards. The new version of ISO 9001 requires you to conduct risk assessments to identify the risks of failing to achieve your quality objectives. So again, a benefit of using an integrated governance system is that your management of all of these governance requirements is handled within a single system. So, the first step in building our integrated governance system is to create a register of requirements. The register is a master list of all the governance requirements that your organization has to meet. If you're using a management system like Phrontex, you create a governance requirement page for each requirement, and the set of those pages automatically creates your register. The purpose of the register is to provide a single point of reference that your directors and managers can go to see, yes, these are all the things we need to be doing. The items of information that you see here, first, just what is the requirement? And second, who is accountable for it? We'll talk some more later about the meaning of accountability here, but the simple version here is that there is, for each governance requirement, there is one position who is accountable for ensuring that the requirement is understood in the organization and the systems are in place to meet the requirement. The second step in building our governance system is to prepare the compliance schedules. For each governance requirement, we create a table setting out in detail what the requirement means to the organization and what we have to do to meet the requirement. This means three pieces of information. First, the detail. Within the table you see the first column, the clause column, is quoting the requirement as stated in the original source document. What does the source actually say? These are the individual clauses of the standards or the statutes or the contract, whatever compliance requirement we're dealing with. Note that we don't have to include every clause from the original. What we are concerned with are the clauses that actually require us to do something to achieve compliance. If you look at a typical statute or standard, there are usually quite a lot of clauses, like definitions, that are necessary for the reading of the document, but which don't require any specific response. What we include here are the ones that do require a response from the organization. Second is the interpretation. What does the requirement, the clause of the requirement, actually mean in the context of the organization's activities? Standards and statutes are always written in general terms. They're intended to apply to organizations in general, usually with the aim of specifying what must be achieved by the organization. The task here, to be carried out by the person accountable for this particular requirement, is to decide specific requirement means in relation to the organization's activities. What does the organization actually do to meet the requirement. Now this is where the efficiency and simplicity of our integrated approach come into play. This is the integration of your governance system, which we'll look at it in detail in a moment. As far as possible, we define implementation not by stating here what we do, but by cross-referencing other elements of the management system, policies, procedures, position descriptions. You make links to those elements through which we achieve compliance. Step 3 in building our governance system is to document the management system. Implementing an effective governance system means your organization. You need policies to set the rules for operation and to authorize the use of expenditure and resources on non-commercial objectives. You need procedures to tell people what they must do, and in particular for governance purposes, to give effect to the checks and controls and reporting mechanisms needed to meet your governance requirements. In this context, procedures includes work instructions, standard practices, standard operating procedures, safe operating procedures, and many other names that people give to documentation that provide instruction to an organization's personnel. And third, you need position descriptions to define the authorities needed for governance purposes. Most management system standards refer explicitly to positions that have authority over aspects of your organization's activities. In order to satisfy those management system requirements, you cross-reference a position description that establishes the required authority. Note that all we're talking about here are the governance requirements for which you need documentation. Of course, you need documentation for good management anyway, unless your organization is documented either as part of your governance project or you have documented it anyway. Without documentation, your governance framework is going to be extremely difficult to implement, to say the least. So, documenting your organization. I'd like to talk for a moment about how not to do governance documentation. There's a traditional approach to managing documentation in which an organization has two types of documentation. Operational documentation that sets out how things are done, how the organization is supposed to function, and governance documentation that sets out separately how the organization does things to meet governance requirements like quality, safety, environmental requirements, and so on. And as you may have experienced for yourselves, this really doesn't work. You end up with a very large quantity of documentation. Your people spend more time creating documentation than they spend using it. It's very difficult to keep it all coordinated. There's duplication of effort and the results are poor. In effect, you're telling people how to do their work, and then separately you're telling them how to do it safely, how to meet quality requirements, and so on. So the downsides of this approach are there's too much documentation, it's too difficult for end users to use, it's too hard for managers to maintain, it's hard to audit, and it doesn't provide assurance to directors and executives that the organization is functioning as it should. Don't use this approach. Here's the right way to do documentation. You want an integrated approach that develops your management system as a single body of knowledge. You provide a single source of truth for everybody in the organization. You have no duplication so that each item of information is in its correct place. And all information should be linked. Accountabilities and responsibilities are linked to position descriptions. And most importantly for our current purposes, governance requirements are linked to policies, procedures, and position descriptions that implement your governance activities. Now, it's possible to do this with sets of physical documents, but it's easier, quicker, and safer to use a web-based content management system like Phrontex. Trying to manage a governance system using traditional documents and spreadsheets is in itself a source of risk in your organization. Unless your organization has full-time personnel dedicated to managing documentation, then it is almost impossible to maintain the body of documentation in the form of documents in a form that is consistent and coherently up to date. Using the integrated governance approach, your governance system is defined as a set of cross-references to policies, procedures, position descriptions, and records. Within your governance schedule, this is the implementation column from a governance schedule, you don't say directly how you meet the requirement. Instead, you create a link to the content elsewhere in your system where you explain what you do and how you do it. For example, to meet the requirements of ISO 14001, this comes from, it's the environmental standard, you need a policy statement. So you set a link to your environment policy. The standard says you have to have a level of awareness across your organization. Your personnel need to know what the requirements are, what the policy is. Now, instead of having a training and awareness module within your environmental management plan, you create a cross-reference to your induction and training procedure. The standard says you have to manage your environmental risks. Now again, you don't create an environmental risk management process specifically for environmental management. You create a cross-reference to your risk management procedure, and you register your risks in the risk register where all your risks, including environmental risks, are recorded. So your policy, your procedure, and your register exist only once, but they may serve multiple standards. This integrated approach has many advantages. First, it means less documentation. Less documentation for your employees to be familiar with, less documentation for your managers to keep up to date, less content for your auditors to review. And the less documentation you have, the more you can standardize. And that has flow-on benefits. The more you standardize, the less work you have to do. The less opportunity there is for error, the less training you need, the less supervision you need. For example, we just mentioned cross-referencing from a governance requirement to the management system elements you use to meet that requirement. Consider the induction and training procedure. You use this to make sure that your employees are aware of your environmental responsibilities, but you'll also need employee awareness for other governance requirements in addition to environment. You'll need it for your quality objectives. You'll need it for your safety and your security objectives, your KYC obligations, and there'll likely be others. And as your organization develops, new standards, new obligations will appear, some may drop off. With the integrated approach, you have just one induction and training procedure. And it meets all your employee awareness obligations. One procedure to manage, one set of records to keep, and one activity to audit. Further benefit of this approach is it clarifies the accountabilities and responsibilities of the person involved in your processes. There are 3 levels of management accountability. There's accountability for the governance system as a whole. Does it address everything it should, and does it work? Ultimately, this is a board accountability. Normally, it falls to the CEO to certify to the board that the CEO is satisfied that the governance system as a whole is working. Second, your governance objectives. Each governance objective has one position accountable for it. That position is accountable for monitoring and preparing for changes to the source requirement. For example, if a new version of a standard is issued or a law is amended, they have to define the implementation of the requirement, identifying the policies, procedures, and position descriptions used to achieve compliance. They have to monitor compliance, and they have to detect, investigate, and report non-compliance. Third, there is accountability for the procedures. Each position with accountability for a procedure within your system must ensure that their procedures are developed and modified so as to meet the requirements of all applicable policies and governance requirements. Now, the counterpart to the management accountabilities are the employee responsibilities. And there are 2. First, employees must comply with policy. Employees are expected to do their work in accordance with all relevant policies, and to that end, employees have to be familiar with those policies. Second, employees are expected to do their work as documented. That is, they're expected to do their work following the documentation. Now, there are 2 parts to this. First, it means that they are expected to follow what the documentation says. At the same time, they are entitled to assume that if they do follow the documentation, their activities will be legal, safe, and effective. In other words, employees expect that their managers, who are accountable for the content of the documentation, have done their jobs thoroughly and have discharged their accountabilities. The 4th step in building our governance system is to monitor performance. With an integrated management system, this reduces to 4 simple questions. First, have we identified all the external factors that are relevant to our operations? Now, this can be quite complex for an organization operating in multiple jurisdictions, and it's a risk area for organizations that are moving into new jurisdictions or taking up new products. But it is ultimately a fairly simple question. It goes back to the register of governance requirements. Does that register have in it everything it ought to have? Second, do our governance objectives address all those factors? If we look through the register of governance objectives, is everything there that we should see? Are we touching on all the matters that are relevant to how this organization functions? Third is validation. Looking at each of the governance schedules, is the schedule, are the elements cross-referenced from that schedule sufficient in principle to meet the governance objectives? For requirements that are subject to audit, This is the desktop audit component. We look through the schedule of requirements, we follow the cross-references. Does it all make sense in principle to achieve the ultimate objective? One of the advantages of using Phrontex for this is that this part of your audit can be conducted externally or conducted remotely because it's a web-based system. And finally, is the implementation effective in practice? Is the organization actually doing everything we should? Are our activities carried out as documented? This is the on-site element of your audit for audit compliance. It's a case of looking through people's activities and comparing those with what the documentation says. Are people doing their work as documented? Now, of course, there's a lot of devil in the detail of this, but one of the benefits, one of the big payoffs of using an integrated management or governance structure, as we've talked about here, is that the details are managed in a simple, straightforward and visible way. Everyone can see what is required, everyone can see what is expected of them, and auditors, outside parties looking at the system, can easily check, they can verify that the systems are in place and are working as they should. The final step of our governance system is about making it better. Nothing is perfect. Even if you get everything perfectly correct today, tomorrow will be different. What we're concerned with at all times, the external world changes. New laws come into effect, standards change, the organization moves into new jurisdictions, new areas of work. So your register of requirements needs constant monitoring. Is it up to date? Second, are your compliance schedules still correct? Things change over time. One of the accountabilities of the personnel involved, accountable for your governance objectives, is to maintain these schedules, make sure that they are still correct, make sure that people remain aware of what's going on, and that you are achieving your objectives efficiently and effectively. Third, your procedures will be changing. Technology changes, market requirements change, new methods and materials come into use, any number of other factors. All of these things mean that your procedures will change, and that may have an impact going backwards on your compliance schedules. If we change a procedure, do we still meet our compliance objectives? Fourth, are we actually achieving the outcomes that we expect? And finally, completing the cycle, does our actual performance mean that we have the right register requirements in our system? In effect, is our system as a whole working as we need it to work? You might recognize this cycle as a version of the deeming improvement cycle. It's a continuous process. You are always looking for greater effectiveness at lower risk, less effort. Showing the outcome of establishing your governance framework is you're able to define what you mean when you say that your organization is well managed. The idea is that you define good management as a set of statements that you want to make about your organization. These statements here are just examples, although they are appropriate for most organizations. even for large organizations we have worked with, the definition of good management normally comes to only 15 or so statements like these. The value of this kind of statement is that it gives your directors and your senior executives a lot of comfort, because they can point to the systems in place. It reassures them that the organization is doing everything it should to meet its obligations, and that they, as directors and executives, are meeting their liabilities in respect of the organization's activities. So, in conclusion, what I hope you are able to take away from this is the basic elements that you need to work through to set up an integrated governance structure for your organization. The next step for you, as I started to say before, you are most welcome to set up a free trial to see whether Phrontex is the way you want to go. As I said, Phrontex is certainly not the only way to set up a governance framework. Of course it isn't. But it is designed to make it easy and quick. It is, in my experience, a much quicker way of setting up a governance system than using traditional documentation. Normally we give a 30-day free trial, but for participants in this webinar, if you contact me, we're quite happy to give you a 90-day free trial. Simply call me or email me for details and I'll set up a system for you, and we can have a private session and I'll show you how to set things up, how to get it working. Another option for you, SADC is hosting governance training on the 2nd to the 6th of October of this year. This is a 5-day training course to be delivered by me. It covers a lot of the same ground as this presentation, but in obviously a lot more detail. The course is intended for managers and governance practitioners. It covers understanding the principles of corporate governance, structuring your corporate governance, learning the roles of the various units, elements of your governance system, and assessing governance in your organization. As I say, it's a 5-day course. Day 1 is Introduction to Corporate Governance in detail. Day 2 is Strategy. Day 3 is Communications. Day 4, Mentoring. And Day 5, Monitoring. It's a very thorough course, and it would give an extremely thorough and detailed grounding for anyone who is accountable for configuring and operating governance within an organization. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Sadek, back to you.
Thank you, George, for the valuable webinars. And actually we will start now send you the questions from the attendant, and I will note all the attendant. The webinar is recorded and will be uploaded in our web, so anybody can reply it in any times and reply the webinars again. First questions, should be the corporate governance done by internal consultant or external consultant?
It is useful to have external consultants assist with corporate governance, but it is critical that internal personnel become accountable for the elements of the governance system. Now, there are two parts to answering this question. One is that setting up the governance framework, when it is first being set up, if the organization doesn't currently have a governance system, then there is a lot of work involved in the documentation of your processes, identifying the governance requirements and so on. And for a simple time perspective, it is useful to have a consultant involved. It is also valuable to have an external person involved at some point just to provide an alternative viewpoint on what the organization is doing and the governance elements that it is vulnerable to. Once the system is established, however, it should be something that the organization is able to operate on its own. Governance is an integral part of an organization's management. It is not something that happens independently, so it can't be managed outside the organization on an ongoing basis.
Good. I can see if there is anybody want to ask questions verbally also, I can give him the phone just to mention his name or raise the hand. I will give him the phone to speak. Here the question from the one attendant said, is the corporate governance is one-time process or is it continuous process?
It's very much a continuous process. Corporate governance, ultimately making sure that your organization is managed and continues to be managed effectively and in such a way that there is a reasonable expectation that the organization will achieve its objectives. So it is something that should always be present in management thinking. This is necessarily the case with governance relating to management system standards because you get audited on those regularly, but it should be something that your senior executives and your board think about always. It should be a part of their continuing monitoring of the organization. And if you look at the major the spectacular corporate failures over the past 15 or 20 years, things like Enron or WorldCom, HIH here in Australia, those were large organizations that failed because their corporate governance failed. It is a responsibility of the organization always to be monitoring to make sure that strategy is right, that the rules are followed, and so on.
Okay. You talk about first step is the registrations. What is the mandatory registrations that the company should do for starting a corporate governance?
I'm sorry, could you ask that again, please?
First step in the corporate governance is to do register. What is the mandatories in the registers for that register of the corporate governance? Mandatory requirement.
Mandatory requirements?
Yes.
That will depend on what jurisdiction you are in and the type of organization. But in most cases, there will be some statutory requirements for you as an organization. I mean, for example, in every jurisdiction I'm familiar with, every company has to submit reports of various kinds. There are workplace safety requirements almost everywhere. So, so there will be a workplace health and safety requirement on that list. If you are a listed organization, there will be the stock exchange rules for wherever you are listed. If you choose to comply with ISO 9001 or ISO 14001 or ISO 26000, each one of those will be on your list. There will be laws relating to the activities that you actually carry out as an organization. For example, I was doing a project just recently for a company that manages some marine ports. So they're handling the ships coming into port and the movement of goods between ships and trains. So they are subject to the railways safety laws, or the railway operations laws, the customs and quarantine laws for the port. They're subject to the rules about foreign ships and the personnel on foreign ships, so that law will appear on the list. So in their case, there are 20 or 30 items of legislation in the register. This is, it's something that normally becomes clear very quickly. I mean, you talk to the chief lawyer in the organization, they will tell you, here are the pieces of law that we have to think about quite often. So each one of those will be in the list. Okay.
Okay. I have a questions here. They say, what is the effectiveness of the corporate governance in increasing the efficiency of the organization?
Okay, good governance makes an organization more efficient. This is, at first blush, people think that governance is an extra burden on, and it's not. In reality, a good governance system forces the organization to think about what it is doing, think about all its procedures, and it encourages the organization to develop a standard and efficient approach to managing those procedures. If you are required to design your procedures so that they meet governance requirements, then you have to design good procedures. And good procedures are more efficient than bad ones, for obvious reasons. And achieving governance objectives is in a sense, the same as meeting performance objectives. That the organization has all these objectives it needs to meet in order to function effectively. With a good governance system, you put all of those objectives together and you use the simplest possible total system to meet all your objectives. And so the outcome is an effective and lean organization with less documentation than organizations that don't worry about governance and just deal with things piecemeal.
Yes.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, another question, they say, what's your advice for a family company who the owner same as the chief executives? What's your advice for the governance for like this company?
Okay. Organizations like that are in some senses at more risk than publicly owned organizations. The key advice I would offer to an organization like that is to ensure that you have some board of directors or equivalent, a management team, that has at least one person who is independent of the family, who can provide an objective viewpoint on what the organization is doing and what factors the organization is taking into account in its strategy and its control mechanism. It's a very common source of failure in an organization that if you have concentrated ownership, such as you described, where the chief executive of the organization, then that person will have a very great deal of control over the strategy that the organization is following. Now, a crucial element of governance is to apply some checks and balances to the strategies to challenge the strategic decisions and to make sure that they are not overly channeled in particular directions by the owner and chief executive. Of course, if the owner and chief executive and the person owns the organization, they are free to do with the organization as they will. But there have been numerous examples of organizations that start well because that can be beneficial. I mean, it's my company, I know what I want to do with it. But sooner or later, that person will make a bad decision. And what you need are some people who are present, who can influence that and say, stop a moment, think about that decision. I don't think that's a good strategy. Classic case, a company called HIH Insurance. It was Australia's largest bankruptcy about 10 years ago. And it was the failure, it was about a $5 billion company, and it failed. And the inquiry into the failure said that the problem was that, although in this case it was a public company, it had one very dominant person who was the chief executive and the chairman of the board. And the board didn't challenge sufficiently. And that company embarked on some strategies that were faulty. The board did not provide the checks and balances that it should have provided. Same concerns apply in the case of your family company. In fact, they are even stronger in that case. So that's my advice. Have some independent voice involved in your management.
Last questions related to the Phrontex. The company already have some electronic information systems, ARB, maintenance information system, health information systems, balance scorecard. How the Phrontex will work within all that electronics information system?
Of course, this is very common. I mean, all the Phrontex users have other information systems. There are two parts to this. One is that Phrontex provides coordination of those information systems. It doesn't replace them. It shows how they relate to each other. But the key function of Phrontex is documentation. Most organizations are dealing with documentation in the form of documents, Word documents or PDFs, and they have a shared library of these somewhere in the system, quite often with SharePoint or something like that. Now the problem with that is that over time new documents get added, but old documents never get removed. Nobody ever says if we're adding this new element to the system, then section 3 of that document is now obsolete and should be removed. So more and more content gets added, the volume of document goes up, and the whole system becomes harder to use. What Phrontex does is it replaces all of that with a single source of truth. Specifically in relation to the other information systems that you just mentioned. One of the first uses of Phrontex was in a large organization. It was an oil and gas company, and they had numerous information systems, such as you mentioned. They had a maintenance system, they had an asset management system, HR, finance, and so on. What they didn't have was any conceptual representation that showed the boundaries between those systems. And that introduced all sorts of risks into the way the organization functioned. For example, they had a maintenance system that was setting out competency requirements for their maintenance personnel. But they also had an HR system that managed competency requirements for personnel in general. And no one had ever defined where those two systems, where one left off and the next one started, not in the IT sense, but in the management system, management sense. Where is the responsibility for competence? Where does it sit with HR? Does it sit with maintenance? And Phrontex provided the mechanism for defining those boundaries. We create the procedures, we define the accountabilities, and we can then link from Phrontex to the other systems. So we can have a procedure within Phrontex and it will say, okay, at this step, step 3 of this procedure, click here, and it will take you out to the maintenance procedure or the accounting procedure and so on.
George Kesteven, thank you for your webinars. You give very important information to improve our organization here in GCC based on compliance with the Vision 2030. Thank you for you, and thank you for all the attendees who attend this webinars. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.